Hello, I'm Philip F6CZB and I'm going to present a remote station prototype with a Raspberry Pi. This is not a new concept. There are some products like the RigPi of MFJ and some open source products of Remote QTH, but I wanted to build a very simple remote station and without any development. What are the prototype goals? To allow to remotely perform a QSO in phone, data, or even CW with a Raspberry Pi 3 as a front end. This Raspberry Pi managing a FT-1000 Mark V field and interfacing in-out audio links. I tested two software configurations. The first one, the radio management, is done on the Raspberry Pi, and this solution will be described here. The second one, the radio management, is done on the PC with the usual software suites such as DXLab and 1MM, AmRadio Deluxe. This will be presented in a later presentation. What is the prototype configuration? You have the Raspberry Pi, the sound card, which is an EVP. This sound card is no longer produced, but any other sound card can be adapted, and even a sound card USB dongle. The FT-1000, an electronic keyer, which is a WinKey emulation on Arduino, which may be connected to the Raspberry Pi. This solution will not be described here. And finally, a remote PC, and you can see the graphical interface to the Raspberry Pi. The FT-1000 is linked to the Raspberry Pi by several links. First one, the CAT liaison. Second link, the PTT. And an in-out audio link to the Raspberry Pi. The audio transmission is the main problem of a remote station due to the latency problem. I tested some solutions with VLC and some native Linux products, but the latency was about 1 second, 1 second and a half, which is unacceptable. Finally, I found Mumble, which is a chat VoIP software, which is used by players of video games and has a very low latency in the order of 50 to 100 milliseconds. What is the configuration of Mumble? There is a Mumble server on the Raspberry Pi, also called Murmure. There are some Mumble clients, one on the Raspberry Pi connected to the radio, and one on the PC connected to the microphone and the loudspeaker of the PC. What is the global software configuration? On the Raspberry Pi, we can find the Raspberry Pi OS in its latest version, Buster, the VNC server, which is native, the Mumble server, the Mumble client linked to the radio management software. I made tests with FLRig, Grig, and RigCTL, and for that application, FLRig was the most user-friendly and was chosen. And finally, WSJT-X to manage the FT-8 communications. On the PC, VNC viewer and the Mumble client linked to the microphone and loudspeaker. I made my test mainly on PC, but it is also possible to install VNC viewer and a Mumble client called Mumla on an Android device. SD card configuration. If the Raspberry Pi does not have a keyboard and a screen at its first boot, one must authorize the remote control by VNC viewer after boot and supply the network parameters before boot if a Wi-Fi line is used. Installation steps. I will not detail all the steps and the scripts. It is described in a separate file. On the Raspberry Pi, Pulse Audio installation to manage the sound card, Mumble server installation and configuration, installation and configuration of a Mumble client which interfaces the radio audio and with a continuous activity to continuously transmit the audio, installation and configuration of FLRig to manage the radio, WSJT-X installation and configuration. On the PC, the VNC viewer installation and configuration, installation and configuration of a Mumble client which interfaces the PC microphone and loudspeaker. This time, it is configured in vocal activity, which is Vox, because the radio transmission is managed by the PTT button on FLRig. What are the physical connections between the Raspberry Pi and the FT-1000 Mark V field? The CAT link with a USB serial converter to the radio CAT DB9. The PTT, also managed by an USB serial converter to the radio DVS2 DTR interface. Audio out from the Raspberry Pi to radio DVS2 audio input, and radio AF out socket to Raspberry Pi audio in. This is the general view of the Raspberry Pi screen via VNC. One can see FLRig managing the radio and the Mumble client linked to the radio audio. Some details about FLRig. One can see that the two VFOs are managed. There is a PTT button, a tune button. Here are two screens of configuration, one for the CAT and one for the PTT with the DTR signal. The Mumble client on the Raspberry Pi, the connection screen, and once connected, the client, the icon is blue because there is a continuous activity. Now the Mumble client on the PC, same procedure for connection, and here we have the PC client, which is green because it is a vocal activity. Finally, the WSJT-X on the Raspberry Pi screen. WSJT-X does not need the Mumble client or FL-Rig. It can directly interface the radio cat and the radio audio, and there is no need to send the FT-8 audio to the PC. There are some references about Raspberry Pi, Mumble, VNC Viewer, and FL-Rig, and WSJT-X. Here are the references about products with Raspberry Pi, either open source or industrial. I hope this video was helpful to you. Don't hesitate to send me questions and have fun. Bye bye.